Nobody sat us down and told us the truth. Not the teachers who drew maps of a world that does not exist. Not the parents who promised that hard work always yields a harvest. Not even the internet, with its endless feed of curated perfection. We were left to find the edges of reality on our own. We found them through the sting of loss. We found them through the silence of a phone that never rings when the floor gives way beneath us. This is not a lecture. This is not some polished speech designed to make you feel better about the state of your life. This is the friction of existence. It is the grit you feel when the plan falls apart and the people you relied on are nowhere to be found. You learned, as we all did, that the world does not owe you an explanation for the cruelty it deals. Every lesson we carry now was paid for in hours spent awake in the dark, wondering why the lessons we were taught in school never mentioned the cold. Put aside the myths. Strip away the comfort. These are the truths that remain when everything else has been burned away. Consider Kwame. He was the anchor for everyone in his orbit. When a co-worker needed a report finished by dawn, Kwame stayed until the office lights buzzed and flickered out. When his roommates demanded a meal, he stood at the stove until his feet ached. He traded his own time and peace for the approval of people who never thought to ask how he was holding up. He lived by the word yes, stacking favors like bricks to build a wall of reliability. But every night, the wall crumbled. He would sit on the edge of his bed in the dark, watching the screen of his phone. It remained black. No texts, no calls, just the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. He had filled everyone else's cup until his own was bone dry. The silence grew heavy, pressing against his chest until he could barely pull air into his lungs. When his neighbor finally knocked on the door and asked if he was okay, the fragile structure of his composure shattered. He realized then that being the one who keeps everyone else happy is the loneliest place to exist. He had spent his life being useful to everyone, only to find he was invisible to himself. Then there is Amara. She spent 4 years at the top of her class, memorizing theories and mastering every exam. She left the lecture halls expecting the world to hand her a key. 5 years later, she was still sitting at the same kitchen table, refreshing job portals until her eyes blurred. The rejection emails were identical, cold, and repetitive. Across town, her cousin, who had walked away from school before the first year ended, was breaking ground on a new plot of land. Amara watched the progress from a distance, the physical weight of her own stagnation growing heavier with every passing month. She felt the gap between her credentials and her reality widen. Her grandmother finally cut through the noise. She sat Amara down and spoke the words that burned. Education opens the mind, but it does not open every door. Some doors require connections, courage, or luck you did not study for. The realization hit like a physical blow. The path she had been promised was a myth. She stopped waiting for the world to offer a reward that was never coming. She stood up, pushed aside the books that had failed her, and began the work of building her own door from the ground up. Bayo lost his job on a Tuesday. By noon, the office key was in the bin, and the silence of his apartment felt like a physical weight. He sat at his desk, staring at his phone, convinced that his network of friends would be his safety net. He called the first, a man he had mentored for years. The response was a stuttered excuse about a busy schedule. He called the second, someone who had shared his table for a decade. A sudden emergency was cited before the line went dead. He tried the third, a person he had once pulled through a crisis of their own. The call went to voicemail. 3 calls, 3 polite, rehearsed rejections. He watched the battery percentage on his phone drain, a visual representation of his dwindling options. He walked to the window, watching the city move without him. The realization settled into his bones like frost. He had spent years investing in people who would not bend an inch to keep him standing. The social map he had carefully drawn was a mirage. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the echoes of his own voice, finally understanding that his loyalty had been a one-way transaction. He was entirely alone, and the people he trusted were nowhere to be found. Daniel worked until his hands were calloused and his back ached with a permanent, dull throb. He spent 14-hour days at the warehouse, lifting heavy crates and tracking inventory, chasing a promotion that never materialized. Across the fence, his neighbor spent his afternoons recording a cat chasing a laser pointer. Within a week, the neighbor had secured a brand deal that dwarfed Daniel's yearly salary. Daniel watched the delivery trucks pull up to the neighbor's house, unloading high-end equipment while he scraped together change for the commute. The bitterness was a physical pressure in his chest. He paced the kitchen, venting his frustration at the ceiling, demanding to know why the math of his life refused to balance. His wife sat at the table in the dim light, watching him dissolve into a cycle of self-hatred. She waited until he stopped to catch his breath. Then she spoke the truth he had been avoiding. The world does not owe you a reward for your sweat. Life is not fair, and it does not keep a ledger of your effort. The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. Daniel stopped pacing. He looked at his hands, then at the wall, and finally let the heavy expectation of justice fall away. He stopped blaming himself for the chaos he could not control. 7 years, 2,555 days. Michael spent every one of them replaying the moment his partner walked out, taking everything he had built. He paced his apartment, the floorboards groaning under his weight, tracing the same path from the window to the desk and back again. He kept a journal of old grievances, adding new pages of justification for his hatred. He imagined the confrontation, the apology he would demand, the vengeance he would take. He talked to the walls, rehearsing arguments for an audience that was not there. The resentment was a physical anchor, pulling him down into the depths of a life he refused to leave. He checked the status of the person who betrayed him, tracking their progress, their new life, their quiet success. While he was busy building a shrine to his own pain, the world outside was spinning on. He looked into the mirror, noting the lines that had deepened from constant scowling. He was a prisoner in a cell of his own design, guarding a gate that had been left open for years. His chest tightened with the effort of holding onto a ghost. He was exhausted, yet he could not put the burden down. Michael sat in the office, his jaw locked, fingers white-knuckled around the armrest. The therapist watched him, waiting for the rehearsed list of grievances to run dry. When the silence finally stretched thin, the therapist leaned forward and asked one question. If you are burning your own house down to hurt them, who is the one standing in the ashes? The words hit like physical impact. Michael tried to conjure the familiar heat of his rage, but for the first time, he found only cold, hollow exhaustion. He looked at the therapist, then at his own trembling hands. The truth was an open door he had refused to walk through for years. The person he hated was gone, living a life that didn't include him, while he had been rotting in the dark. He felt the tightness in his chest begin to unravel. It was not a sudden burst of relief, but a slow, painful draining of a poison he had been drinking every day. He slumped in the chair, his shoulders dropping, the breath leaving his lungs in a long, shuddering exhale. He let go of the anger. It left him shivering, stripped of his only companion, but finally capable of seeing the room around him. Ade sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, the air inside the car growing heavy and stale. For 20 years, he had operated under a single, rigid command. Men do not cry. He had lived by it, locking every disappointment, every failure, and every sharp edge of grief behind a wall of granite. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, the leather creaking under the pressure. He stared through the windshield at the empty street, his throat burning with the effort of holding back the tide. Then, he heard a sound, a radio playing a melody from his childhood, and the wall splintered. He did not fight it. He leaned forward, forehead resting against the wheel, and the first sob tore through him. It was violent, racking his entire frame. He gasped, his lungs struggling for air as the sound filled the small space. He kept crying, the tears streaming, his chest heaving with the force of 2 decades of silence finally pouring out. The pressure that had defined his life for years began to dissipate, leaving him exhausted but upright. He was no longer holding the weight. He was finally breathing. Olu lived by the glow of 3 monitors, his world defined by deadlines and the relentless stream of incoming emails. His phone sat on the desk, a black rectangle that vibrated across the surface every few hours. He saw the name on the screen, Mother, and he flipped it over, face down, without a second thought. He had work to finish. He had a career to build. He told himself he would call back tomorrow, always tomorrow. The next day, the phone buzzed again during a conference call. He silenced it with a sharp tap of his finger, his eyes never leaving the spreadsheet. He was building a future, and he convinced himself that these interruptions were obstacles to his progress. He missed the 3rd call, then the 4th. He stopped glancing at the screen entirely, letting the notification light blink into the empty office space long after he had clocked out for the night. He was constantly busy, constantly moving, constantly choosing the next task over the person who had raised him. The calls kept coming, rhythmic and persistent, echoing in the quiet of his apartment. He let them go to voicemail, one after another, unaware that the window for conversation was closing, minute by agonizing minute. The silence that followed each missed call grew heavier, a physical weight settling in the air, marking the time he would never get back. The final call did not come from his mother. It was his sister. She spoke 3 words that stripped the floor from beneath him. He left his desk, the screen still flickering with unfinished reports, and drove until the city noise faded into the hum of the cemetery gates. The air here was sharp, biting, and smelled of damp earth. He walked the path, his boots crunching on gravel that sounded too loud in the stillness. He stopped at the fresh mound of soil. No marble headstone yet, just a wooden marker and a scattering of wilted flowers. He reached down, his fingers brushing the cold, loose dirt. There was no vibration in his pocket, no buzzing screen, no deadline to meet. He had spent months pushing her away, trading her voice for the flicker of a monitor, convinced that tomorrow would always be there to make amends. Now, the earth was silent. He stood there for an hour, the wind pulling at him, watching the shadows lengthen across the grass. Every plan he had made to visit, every "I will call later" he had rehearsed, dissolved into the dirt. Tomorrow had arrived, but the person he needed was gone. He knelt, pressing his hand against the cold ground, finally understanding that time does not wait for anyone. Far from the city, by the edge of a highway where dust coated every leaf, a woman stood behind a charcoal stove. She lit the fire before dawn. She chopped onions until her eyes stung and her hands grew calloused. She laid out plates for travelers who rarely stopped. A car slowed. A driver glanced at her stall, then accelerated back into the haze, leaving her with the smoke and the silence. She did not pack up. She did not curse the road. She reached for the next pot, stirred the contents, and wiped the counter clean. She had spent years watching others move faster, climb higher, and claim the rewards she had been promised. But the fire remained hot, and the work remained necessary. She realized that success was not the moment a crowd gathered or a breakthrough occurred. It was the rhythm of her hands on the steel, the steam rising in the morning air, and the simple, stubborn refusal to walk away. She showed up, she lit the fire, she served the meal. She understood that she was not waiting for a destination to find her. She was building the ground she stood on, one day at a time, in the quiet spaces where no one else bothered to look. The truth is not found in the plans you make or the rewards you were told to expect. It exists in the weight of the air right now. It is in the work you choose to finish, the anger you finally decide to let go, and the people you decide to hold close before the light fades. Stop waiting for the world to offer you a different version of your life. The reality you face today is the only one you possess. Build your own door, walk through the fire, and stop looking for the finish line. There is no destination waiting for you. There is only the step you take next.